Hello and welcome to On the Ledge podcast, bringing you botany to your bedroom and cacti to your kitchen since 2017. I'm Jane Perrone, your host. Yes, this is how I sound. This is not just how I answer the phone. I am bringing you this week an episode on the wonderful world of succulents that come from South Africa and Madagascar, to find out why you need to be a little bit careful with that Euphorbias sap, why caudiciform plants look different in the wild, and why growing your succulents in pumice may be the answer to all those overwatering issues. We visit the greenhouse of Bob Potter, treasurer of the International Euphorbia Society and a very, very fine succulent collector. I'll also be answering a listener question about how to make a climbing plant make friends with a moss pole. And we'll also be airing the second of our Meet the Listener interviews with lovely listener Bobby. Thanks to my new Patreon subscribers this week. That's Coach, Sal, Elizabeth and Bronwyn. It is truly wonderful to add you to the Patreon clan of people who support the show financially every month, and those people are very valuable because they make the show happen. Without them I could not make On the Ledge. So a big shout out to all my patrons this week. It's Thank You Patrons Week on Patreon, so I should emphasise how much I owe you guys. You really make the show possible, so well done. Give yourself a pat on the back, go and make yourself an extra nice cup of tea and bask in the glory of being a jolly nice person. Thank you also to Meerkat Jungle, who left a lovely 5-star review for On the Ledge on Apple Podcasts. Your review made me laugh, Meerkat Jungle, because you were apparently planning to turn yourself into the authorities for crimes against plants, and then you found On the Ledge, and apparently it's been your salvation. And you also praise my show notes, which I'm very grateful about because I do put a lot of work into the show notes. So thank you for pointing that out in your review. If you want to leave a review for On the Ledge, I would be ecstatic for you to do so. Every time I see a new review, it gives me a little bit of a shot in the arm and helps me get through those long editing sessions. And it also helps other people find the show. So thank you to all of you who've left reviews in the past. And if this is spurring you on to think about leaving a review, then good. I'm glad to hear it. I first met Bob Potter at Cactus World Live, which you will remember took place in the late summer, and I did a live show from there. It was great fun. And Bob was manning the stall of the International Euphorbia Society, as well as selling some plants. So I bought a couple of plants off him and invited myself to his greenhouse, as one does when one is the host of a houseplant podcast. Bob founded and ran the nursery 2B's Exotics for 35 years before retiring from the trade in 2016, but he still very much has an interest in these plants, and he's the treasurer of the International Euphorbia Society and has a very impressive greenhouse full of succulents behind his home in Woking, Surrey, which is a few miles southwest of London if your British geography is a little bit sketchy. I visited a couple of weeks ago and Bob was so kind to give me a wonderful tour of his plants, talk about his obsession with these succulents, and yes, he did give me a few plants. Oh gosh, yes, I love my job. I'm so lucky. So, as I always say, do check out the show notes at janeperrone.com as you listen for pictures and details of the plants we're talking about, and you can also find details there about the International Euphorbia Society, because euphorbias are so popular now, and many of the things that we call cacti are actually euphorbias, so it's definitely a genus of plants that's on the up. And I felt really lucky to spend an hour or so pottering with Bob Potter in his greenhouse. Thank you very much for letting me have a look around.
Pleasure.
This is a wonderland of spininess. What does your collection focus on?
Well, basically most of the collection is based on succulent plants. Most people will be familiar with the term cacti and succulents. There are a few cactus plants here, but the majority of plants that I grow are succulents. And basically, again, I suppose specifically it comprises a lot of South African and Madagascan plant material. And Madagascan plant material has been one of my passions for many years now, so I'm very much into those sort of plants.
So what is it about the Madagascan climate that makes it produce plants like we see in front of us? Some of them, we've got a lot of caudiciforms, spininess. I've never considered what the climate or ecosystems like in Madagascar.
Well, you've got to realise that Madagascar is the fourth largest island in the world. It's over 1,000 miles long, so I mean there is a bit of a climatic difference between the north and the south, and from east to west even, in terms of rainfall and stuff like that. But generally speaking, you've got to consider the place to be quite warm due to its location. So I mean, in terms of keeping plants from Madagascar, I always tend to keep them on the warmer side. Now, I suppose the absolute minimum temperature that I would really want to take my Madagascan stuff down to is 10 degrees C. But in this greenhouse that we're sitting in here at the moment, we're sort of keeping about 16, 17 degrees C. And I think that's probably a better way of actually keeping these plants alive over a winter period, because that is generally for us the worst time of the year to keep these plants going.
And how did you get into this particular branch of the cacti and succulent world?
Well, I mean, it started for me at a very, very early age. My grandfather, we lived with my grandfather when my mother and father were married, and they had to live with my grandfather and grandmother because they couldn't afford a house at the time. And I was brought up with my grandfather, who was one of these great amateur gardeners. And he had a small greenhouse in his garden, and he grew all sorts of stuff in the greenhouse. But he did have a few cactus plants in there. And I remember, and I've got pictures from a very early age, but I was virtually sort of standing in nappies helping him in his greenhouse with his plants. And he then produced a Chamaesyria sylvestrii, peanut cactus is commonly known. You don't actually see a great deal of them these days. No.
I know, that's very true. What happened to the pig? It used to be one of the commonest things, didn't it, when I was a kid?
It's strange, isn't it, really?
Where have they all gone?
Yeah, amazing. But, I mean, this thing used to flower so prolifically every year, and he used to go and stick it in front of the fire in the living room and make all these flowers open. And I was obviously really taken with this at a very young age, you know. And I was so taken with the cactus plants that he sort of made me guardian of the cactus plants at an early age. So you could probably say from about 3-4 years old, I've been sort of brought up with cactus plants, and then it was a natural progression from there, I think, to sort of cactus, succulents, and then dropping the cactus to a degree, and then sort of concentrating on the succulent plants.
Well, you've got a wonderful collection here. There's lots of things that are drawing my eye. Let's just have a look at some of these caudiciform plants first of all, because I know lots of listeners are really into some of these caudiciforms. There's some big ones here. What's your favourite of these caudexes we see? Well,
I mean, I do quite like, for example, this sort of bulbous thing here. This is a Madagascan plant. That's a Xeroscius pubescens, and so you get this sort of almost rounded ball-shaped plant. It does tend to vine quite a bit, and it can get sort of a little bit out of hand, so I sort of tend to trim the vines down.
It's huge. That's like a sort of a, I don't know, is it not quite a flattened football, I suppose, the size of it?
Yes. And I mean, similarly, that's from Madagascar, that one, and I mean, similarly, you get a similar looking thing like the Phocea edulis from South Africa. But of course, what you've got to consider is that in their natural habitat, most of this plant is buried underground. You don't actually see this caudiciform plant, or the caudex as such. It's usually underground. And I mean, as sort of hobbyists or growers of these sort of plants, we tend to raise this material above ground to sort of enhance it a little bit, if you like. But if you look at some of the smaller stuff, for example, if you come across over here, where I've got some smaller plants buried out, things like pachypodiums, smaller pachypodiums, Pachypodium brevicauli, I mean, they can get quite large in habitat, but they're very slow growing here, or tend to be from seed. But some of the smaller Cordiciforms I actually do bury right up to their neck, which is more akin to the way they sort of live in their natural environment.
It's lovely the way you've got these bedded out here, because oftentimes we don't see how plants would look in the wild. We see them in pots, but it's lovely to see things kind of displayed as they would be, as you might see them in the wild. And I know you pot everything into pumice, is that right? Can you tell me a bit about pumice and why that's good to use?
Well, I think this is always a bone of contention amongst
it's controversial, isn't it?
People often say, what do you grow your stuff in? What do you grow your plants in? Well, I think it's horses for courses in a lot of instances for people, because I would probably be fair to say that over the years I've tried every combination there is, and I've used peat-based composts, I've used John Innes style composts, I've used grit, gravel, you name it, anything I've mixed in with compost to try and sort of get the free draining aspect that most people tend to say that you would need with these sort of plants. But then recently, I've just potted everything that I grow into this sort of pumice material, and it has, from my point of view, several advantages. It is free draining. When you water it, any excess water will run completely out of the bottom of the pot or drain through into the bottom of the bed, and you can actually see when it dries out as well quite easily. It will turn a darker colour when it's wetter, and it will come back lighter when it's a little drier. So you can, from my point of view, actually control the moisture content of your potted material a little bit better. The other thing I think is that it tends to promote quite a better root growth system, and if you ever want to repot plant material as well, if you want to tip it out of a pot of pumice, you can just knock it out, shake the pumice away, and then you're not sort of like got a cake of material that you sometimes get with peat-based composts and things like that. So I've gone over to that completely, basically now. And I think a lot of the hobbyists in the cactus and succulent world are actually going over to it as well, because I've sold quite a bit of this stuff to many members of the society over the years, and I think it's becoming more and more popular.
Oh, that's interesting. And does that affect in terms of feeding? Does that affect the feeding in that there's no nutrients naturally in the pumice?
That is one of the drawbacks, if you like, that you do have to feed a lot more than you would under normal circumstances. And I suppose, again, it depends on your conditions in the glasshouse, because this is another thing. People say, well, how often do you water your plants? Well, I can't tell you. You've got to sort of see what happens in your own greenhouse, because the greenhouse that we're standing in here at the moment, although it's the same size as another glasshouse that I have, the other glasshouse is a lot higher, and you would be quite surprised how different the climatic condition is between the two greenhouses. So there's no hard and fast rules. But yes, I would probably feed, I would say, every second watering. Maybe not in full strength of whatever feed you're going to be using, but maybe half strength feed, and every time I water I use half strength feed every 2 waters. Yeah.
Okay, well it's great to see, as I say, it's great to see this collection and see the plants in their situation as opposed to in a pot. Although I do love the pots too. And on the other side, you've got this wonderful display, more Cordiciforms, more interesting spiny things. Tell me about some of your favourites from this side.
Yes, well, of course, there is quite a few potted plants here as well. And I think if I look along this line here, we are actually in a difficult time of the year. Well, not a difficult time of the year, but the time of the year when most of these plants are wanting to go dormant. So there's going to be a lot of leaf drop on a lot of these plants, so they never look their best in the middle of November. But one that has still retained quite a bit of its leaf is this one, for example, Euphorbias viridiflora from way up on the top end of Madagascar. And it just looks like a little miniature tree. So to me it's a fascinating looking plant. full of leaf, as you can see at the moment. They will drop off eventually. And some of the other plants, if you go along a bit further here, you've got a Pachypodium densiflorum out of Madagascar. I mean, it's just got this lovely fat sort of body with these sort of protruding arms coming off. Again, you can see the leaves are starting to drop. Perfectly natural at this time of the year when they go into their dormancy.
And the Euphorbias are really, I guess, becoming more and more popular as in the cacti and succulent world. I suppose Euphorbia millii is one of those ones that is very, well, certainly, again, I'm going back to my past, but was extremely popular at one point, wasn't it?
Well, and still is, really.
Still is, yeah.
Still is as a house plant. I mean, Euphorbia millii, basically, they've been hybridised to death over the years by the Dutch and the Danes.
They have been. I was looking into that at one point because somebody was asking me for an idea on something, and I said, I can't tell you anymore because there's so many different hybrids of this plant. Why was that the case? Is it because it's easy to hybridise? Or?
Yeah, I think there's that point. It's very free flowering, of course.
Right.
I mean, if you go back to sort of if you go back to the sort of, for example, Euphorbia splendens, which is the crown of thorns, which everybody knows about, and again, that's a plant you don't actually see in its entirety at this very much at this time. But the millii types, as I say, they've been very much hybridised, and they will hybridise, or the Dutch or the Danes, in actual fact, will hybridise them with all sorts of larger flowered Euphorbias, like Pauliana, and they produce. You could often see them in garden centres, the millii type, bushy type plants with much larger flowers. Very popular. I mean, they've got all sorts of colours coming on them as well now. So I think it was a natural thing. The millii types actually do grow quite well. Very well suited to houseplant culture.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, I mean, I guess that's one. I mean, I don't have any of those at the moment. I've had them in the past, and they've been wonderful houseplants and lots of colour. So I can see why they're popular. But I can also see the attraction of these slightly more, shall we say, exclusive Euphorbias. That, I mean, some of these must be quite old because they're enormous. Yeah, well, have these been in your collection for a long time?
Yes, they have. And I mean, you know, the fascination for me with Euphorbias, I mean, Euphorbiaceae is probably one of the larger one of the largest plant families. But if you take the Euphorbia species generally, you can get plants from very tiny geophytics, sort of underground tubers, very small tubers, maybe 5 centimetres, 2-3 centimetres even diameter. And then you're going up to large trees, up to sort of maybe 10 metres high. So there's such a range of growth modes amongst the Euphorbiaceae. And that's really, I think, for me, one of the fascinations. I mean, I love the sort of small geophytic types, which is quite easily turning around, looking into the bed that we've got here now. You know, there's lots of them, sort of very small cordexes, basically. Most of it buried underground, as you can see. But then if you look round on the other side, I mean, we haven't got anything monstrous in this greenhouse but you're talking now about Euphorbias sort of getting up into sort of bushy, shrubby types, up to sort of maybe 3, 4, 5 feet high. If you look in the bed at the back, you've got some lovely Euphorbias up there, which are sort of more columnar types. This lovely monodinium, for example, I know it's not a Euphorbia species, although they do include it in Euphorbia these days, which to me, frankly, I don't go along with it. However, that's another story.
Taxonomy
they'll always be monodiniums to me.
Yes.
But I mean, this is a beautiful thing, the Monodinium spinescens out of Tanzania. It's just looking a fantastic shrub. And the Euphorbia venenifica next door to it, I mean, that's a West African plant. They tend to be a little bit more difficult to grow, the West African sort of stuff, but you know, that's really looking quite nice. So you know, you get a mode of growth like this, almost getting into tree-like proportions, and comparing it to sort of very tiny underground tubers.
Tell me about this thing in this planted corner bed here with the giant leaves, because that is quite something.
Yes, Cyphostemma juttae. Yeah, they do. They do get quite big. Some of the leaves. I mean, this one planted out, and it's amazing how well these things do when they're planted out. I mean, if you just turn around and look at one in a pot.
Oh yes.
Okay. I mean, it's not an unsubstantial plant, but of course it's being restricted. And that one over in the bed was probably put in a year ago at that sort of size, so you can see the difference in the leaf growth that it's made by being in a bed. You know,
those grey-green leaves, they're probably, I mean, they're not rhubarb shaped, but they're at least rhubarb sized, aren't they? They are very impressive.
Yeah.
And will those drop off eventually?
Yeah,
They'll
will.
go off.
Yeah, you can see it's already.
Yeah, that one's on the potted one. Yes.
Yeah, they're ready to come away. So yes, they will come off, and then they'll start up again next year.
We'll be back to the succulents soon, but now we go from Bob to Bobby for our second Meet the Listener slot. Take it away, Bobby.
Hi everyone, I'm Bobby from London. My passion for houseplants really started in about 2000 with aquascaping and aquatic planting, but over the years that's really increased to include lots of different groups of houseplants, in particular aroids and begonias, so much so that I started the UK Facebook group Aroid Adoration, which helps UK aroid lovers share information and make connections and even swap and sell plants.
Question 1. There's a fire and all your plants are about to burn. Which one do you grab as you escape?
Oh, Jane, that's such a mean question. I think I have well over 100 houseplants. Some of them have been so difficult to find because they're quite rare. Others have resulted in really good friendships over the years, and I think each one of them has their own little story to tell. I think I would perish in my own indecision.
Question 2. What is your favourite episode of On the Ledge?
Am I allowed to pick 2? They both happen to be double episodes. The first one is the visit to James Wong's flat. To me, he's such an influence, and it's really inspiring, particularly his work with aquatic planting and terrestrial houseplants. I love the way that he merges the two together and creates a beautiful aesthetic. The second one is the conversation with Peter D'Amato and carnivorous plants. I love carnivorous plants. I've got a few myself, and it's so interesting to learn about their evolution and how difficult they can be to care for. So I particularly loved listening to those 2 episodes.
Strictly speaking, Bobby, that's actually 4 episodes, but seeing as it's you, I'll let it go. Question 3. Which Latin name do you say to impress people?
I'm going to preface this by saying that if you're into aroids and begonias, there's such diverse groups of plants with so many species that some of them just don't have common names at all. So you kind of have to use scientific names. But the ones I would say would be Philodendron Varsovecii aurea flavum. I don't even know if I'm pronouncing that correctly. Or Begonia darthvaderiana, purely because it's named after Darth Vader.
Question 4. Crassulation, acid metabolism, or guttation?
Okay, this is an easy one. Since I'm really into my aroids, it has to be guttation. I remember getting my first colocasia and coming down in the morning and discovering little pools of water and thinking, what the hell is this? After a little bit of research online, I discovered it was when the plant exudes water from the end of its leaves, and thinking, wow, that's really cool. But not one if you've got carpets.
Question 5. Would you rather spend £200 on a variegated monstera or £200 on 20 interesting cacti?
You can probably guess that I would pick the variegated monstera over the 20 cacti. Not that I don't love and respect cacti and succulents, but I'm also guilty as I have a variegated monstera, so I would always spend that £200 on a variegated aroid.
Thanks to Bobby for taking part in Meet the Listener, and if you fancy hearing your voice on the Ledge, then do drop me a line to ontheledgepodcast@gmail.com. It's open to all. And now back to my chat with Bob Potter of the International Euphorbia Society, where I find out things not to do with a euphorbia. What are the sort of health and safety with euphorbias? Obviously, we've got the sap and also the spines. Obviously, it's fairly straightforward, isn't it? You know, don't get yourself covered in the sap. No. Don't get yourself spiked. But is there anything more to it than that?
Yeah, no, they do all have a milky sap, which is generally deemed to be fairly toxic. So, yeah, the answer is if you've got any cuts on your fingers or whatever, and you're messing about with euphorbias and or de-leafing or anything like that, don't get the sap into a cut, because it does tend to sort of irritate and sting.
Have you been there with that?
I have. I think everybody who's touched them has been there with it.
Yes.
Particularly in the eyes. Don't rub the eyes, because then that can sting quite a lot. And one other thing to bear in mind is that some of the euphorbias, some of the columnar euphorbias have got quite strong pressure in the capillaries, and if you take a cutting, you can almost get a mist off of the plant.
Oh, really?
And you won't see it. And I did that once. I took a cutting off an East African euphorbia, chopped its head off, and without even knowing it, for days afterwards, I had this very strong stinging sensation in the eyes. So it was definitely that misting.
Yes.
From the plant.
That's amazing. Well,
some of them are really toxic. So the Euphorbia abdulkuri, for example, from Socotra, is a particularly nasty one. But generally speaking, I mean, they're not generally life-threatening, but no. They're just irritating. But
you just need to know
you
what
have to
not
be a
to
bit
do.
careful.
Yes,
particularly if you've got children around and stuff like that, of course.
Yeah. And one other plant that was catching my eye was this super spiny specimen here. Tell me, is that a euphorbia or is that something else? It's so spiny.
No, that's an Aloaldia. That's also from Madagascar.
Okay.
That's Aloaldia humbertii. It's a shrubby species. Most of the Madagascar Aloaldias tend to be very columnar, very upright, and in fact there's one.
Oh,
this is an Aloaldia. This is Aloaldia montagnacii. So you can see their upright stems. I mean, this is only a baby compared to the sort of size they get in Madagascar. But that one remains, the humbertii remains bushy as such. But yeah, it is quite substantial spination on there.
I can imagine that's seeing off a few creatures that might want to have a nibble. I can see the point. Yeah. That's amazing. And what else did I want to ask you about? I wanted to ask you about some of these sort of mess of spaghetti type plants that you've got over here. This one and this one. Is this a euphorbia or is this something completely different?
No, that's a Syringia. This one here, you mean?
Yeah.
There's a Syringia.
I've never even heard of that.
No, again, there's a Madagascar plant.
Is there a cordex under there?
Yeah, well, it's a thickened root, really, basically. It's not such a fat thing, so it does have quite a lot of normal root system on it. But this, again, is a training plant, and it will sort of creep up amongst the branches and leaves of other bushes and trees here. But it is an odd-looking thing. It's very thin stems, almost sort of got a bit of a hairy situation going on them.
Yeah, I just thought something about that caught my eye. I don't know why. Yeah. Are there any particular euphorbias specifically that you'd recommend to somebody who wanting to get started collecting some euphorbias, and they've maybe got, I don't know, like me, they've got Euphorbia trigona that they got from the garden centre. Right. Where do you go next with euphorbias when you want to start sort of getting more into these plants?
Well, I suspect that one of the more common plants that people are going to be able to easily get hold of is something like Euphorbia obesa, which is a South African plant. It's a small rounded globular plant. There is one in the bed over there.
You know what, that was one of as a child, that was a plant that I absolutely adored.
Yeah. I mean, it goes under various sort of common names, the tartan ball and stuff like this. I mean, they're very attractive plants in their own right. But of course, they're produced by the millions in Holland and various places. But strangely enough, they're not they're quite endangered in their natural habitat.
Right.
We visited one habitat of Euphorbias obesa, and it was quite decimated in South Africa.
Is that because people are taking them from the wild?
Yeah, a lot of it is. Yeah, I mean, this was on a protected area, and it was sponsored by the BCSS. Actually, it was at a place called Kendrew, on a farmer's land, and he took us to the area. Wasn't quite near his farmhouse because these South African farms are quite vast. I mean, it was about a 10-minute drive away. But it was fenced as well. But he was quite upset because he said he actually had a school party come down from Cape Town to have a look round at this habitat, and he said when he went back and had a look, there was lots of holes where plants had been taken away.
Well, it's a shame, isn't it? Because if you say, if it's produced easily, then why do you need to take it from the wild? But I guess that's the temptation of these fascinating plants on people. And is the care of that plant like you would do a cactus or succulent? Lots of sun, no water in winter and cool in winter.
Generally speaking, but it depends again where you're growing them. I mean, you can probably grow these on a window ledge indoors quite easily in a good light position, and you can probably keep this thing growing all through the year. I mean, in this particular environment that I've got in the greenhouse, everything tends to be a bit drier over the winter, kept warmer but drier, and therefore they're not in active growth anymore. But yeah, I mean, that's the sort of thing that most people will start off with if you want to start a Euphorbia collection. And then you'll probably get into some of the milii types as well. I mean, they don't necessarily have to be the sort of bog standard hybrid types of milii, but you can get very easily through some of the specialist nurseries things like this, which is it's not actually a milii, but it's very akin to a milii. And these are quite easy to grow, little sort of shrubby plants.
I'm just looking at the label there. Euphorbia. What's the Latin name on that one? It's a long one.
Antificiensis.
Oh, okay. I like the little tiny lemon yellow flowers on that. It's very delicate.
That's right.
Yeah. Well, it's a fantastic collection. Is there anything else in here that is your absolute baby that you would, in the case of a fire, you'd be grabbing it first? Is there anything that you really prize above all else?
Yeah, I mean, there are one or two things really, I guess. I mean, although, you struggle to lift some of them quickly. I mean, I quite like this thing. This is Dorstenia gigas. This is from the island of Socotra. And I mean, again, compared to some of the plants that I've seen in habitat over there, this is still only a baby, but I mean, it's a fairly substantial plant.
How big would that get in the wild then?
I've seen them 3.5 metres high.
Oh my gosh, okay.
And sort of like about almost a metre fat. So it's a really peculiar plant. So things like that, I mean, I would like to sort of like take that away with me. And also even going down to the small stuff, very much like this, Euphorbia gymnoclissioides. This is from Ethiopia. And if anybody's growing cacti and succulents, I mean, the gymnoclissioides label attached to it, of course, is because it very much resembles a gymnoclisium, the cactus genus.
You probably had more luck if you were rushing out away from a fire. You'd probably have more luck picking that up because it's the size of a conker, isn't it?
Right. Yeah,
Just to tell me what's the purpose on the bigger plants over here? You've got some. Is that like a strap to lift it out when you repot, or is that some?
It was a bit of what do you call the stuff?
Like matting?
Yeah, the capillary matting.
Matting,
It's escaped me from it. Yeah, there's a bit of capillary matting goes down there to the drainage hole.
Okay.
Occasionally I just used to sit it in a little bath of water so it could soak, because they love a drink. They really do take a lot of water during the growing season. So.
Well, I guess with that size of that cortex, you can imagine. Yeah, I guess this is one of the things is that we get sort of thinking, oh, well, they're dry plants, so we mustn't water them. But so often in the growing season, you realise they can take on a lot of water.
Indeed they do, yes. I mean, I think this is a misconception. It's also a misconception with a lot of cactus plants, actually, that you don't need to water them very much. Well, the fact is, if you don't water them, generally speaking, they'll survive.
They'll just sit there, I guess.
And do nothing. But I mean, to grow successfully, they do need a certain amount of water. And certainly some of these succulents can take an enormous amount of water. Much, much more than people probably will realise.
Yes, yeah. Yeah, that's very true. Well, that is an incredible looking plant. I would love to see a 3 metre high one of those, because that is just stunning.
Yeah.
And is there anything that you've got a love-hate relationship with, that you just can't get rid of but can't really get along with? There must be something that drives you nuts. Or
Well,
you
there is, and it probably drives a lot of people nuts. I mean, there's one round the corner. I keep pulling them out and throwing them away. But
I think I know what you're going to come. What I'm coming round to here.
Yeah,
It's the old mother of millions,
that's it. Yeah.
as they call it.
They come up everywhere.
Yes.
And I mean, quite frankly, they're quite an attractive plant when they're nicely grown. But you'll never get rid of them. But
That's right, they are.
But and funny enough, they are not very common in habitat.
Oh, really?
No, I mean, there's a Kalanchoe tomentosa, which is sort of the hairy-leaved one.
Yes, yeah.
You very, very rarely see it in Madagascar. You will find it in various places growing. But I mean, it's sort of like it's almost like the Euphorbias obesa, bog standard sort of house plant being grown in Europe, basically. But yeah, those things, I mean, okay, they'll come up and go. And however much you try to get rid of them, there'll always be some sitting around somewhere.
Indeed, very true.
But apart from that, no, I don't think so, really. I mean, I try to keep my plant collection down to stuff that I find attractive to grow. I think you'll find that some of the least attractive plants are some of the rarest around. So, I mean, probably still, if we're sort of really passionate hobbyists, we do have a duty to sort of try and grow these things as well.
I'm just my eye's been drawn to something over here. I can see a Kalanchoe on here that has. Is this where you propagated from leaves? And I've forgotten the
This is
species.
Kalanchoe origalis. And these are leaves taken from a plant that we were in Madagascar last November, about this time last year actually, and these were leaves taken from a plant, and they're just stuck into the pumice there, and they're regenerating.
As easy as that. So just from the petiole, they're growing.
Right. Yeah.
Well, they're lovely, aren't they? They've got such a gorgeous colour.
They do need coming out now.
Well, so what will you do with those now? Will the original leaf be cut off, or just allowed to die back? Or
that's the best plan.
Yeah.
Now. I'm going to make you a gift of that one.
Oh, that would be lovely. So how often have you managed to go to Madagascar and actually see these plants in the wild?
Oh, my wife Beryl's been with me, and I've been with several Dutch mates. Probably about 5 times now we've been over the years, and as I say, the latest excursion was November last year. And every time we go, we either try to find somewhere different to go, some different place to look at, but we're always finding different plants all over the place.
Oh well, that must be wonderful to be able to see the plants in their setting, and hopefully help you appreciate how to grow them a little bit better as well.
Well, it does to a degree. It does, yeah, because I mean, one thing you do learn is sort of like a bit of the sort of soil composition, because I always bring back soil samples with me and have them analysed.
Oh, really?
And one of the things I found that in mostly Madagascan habitats, you're talking about soil having a condition of about 4.5 pH. So it's fairly acid.
Yes.
And again, another thing, I try and translate that here by using, if I can, rainwater, or if not, I acidify the tap water.
I have to say, I do. I have lots of listeners who live in apartments and flats and don't have access to rainwater. But I have to say, personally, and lucky as I am to have a garden and to have access to lots of water butts, I do love using rainwater on my houseplants. They do seem to like it. You can get away with tap water for a lot of things, but I do definitely think that if you can get rainwater, it's a wonderful resource, isn't it?
I think so. Well, it has the added advantage as well, because with the number of plants that I've got here, to water individually is virtually impossible. So you generally have to hose pipe them. So if I've got a tub full of rainwater, I just pump it out of there. And it also negates the fact that you don't mark up leaves with sort of the salts and the...
Yes. Yeah, that's very true. Yeah, I do love the rainwater. I have now got a milkman, an old-fashioned milkman, and so when I don't know if this is a ridiculous thing to do, and I don't really do it so much with my cacti and succulents, but more with my foliage plants. I do now find myself filling up, when the bottle of milk's finished, I go out to the water butt, fill it up with rainwater, bring it inside, bring it to room temperature. And so they get, I don't know if it's any good for the plants, but in my weird mind, it has some benefit that they're getting a little bit of calcium, I don't know. And I'm just rinsing out the milk bottle at the same time. So I feel quite good about that. Doesn't seem to have done any harm so far. I guess we all have our little foibles
when it
comes to watering.
I mean, you're talking about warm water as well, keeping it warm before you water plants. A lot of people say, that's the best way to go. Don't do it straight out the tap because it's cold. And I had a Dutch mate of mine. Every year he wakes up his plants by watering his plants directly out of his central heating boiler. So God knows what temperature that is.
Wow, okay. That's interesting. I have been known to, if I've been desperate to water something and I've got cold rainwater, especially in the winter, I have been known to put it in the microwave to heat it up quickly. The things we do for our plants, it's amazing, isn't it? Yeah. And at this time of year, is this a quiet time of year when you're kind of not doing a lot of repotting and you're just in a holding pattern till spring? Right. Yeah,
as I say, most things now are sort of getting into their dormancy. In fact, I mean, even now, in middle of November here, we've got some really nice weather, actually. So, I suppose winter's a bit late coming. But, most things, as you can see, a lot of things haven't got leaves on. And you can see a lot of things that have had leaves on are now starting to brown and wither and dropping. So that's the drawback, one of the drawbacks with having a succulent collection like this, that you're forever hoovering up the leaves.
Yes, yeah. Well, it's a wonderful collection. It's great to see, and it's obviously so well cared for and tended. I mean, this greenhouse is immaculate, I have to say, compared to my greenhouse. And a lot of greenhouses I come to see, it's very, very neat and tidy. So you obviously take great pride in your collection. So thank you very much for showing me around, Bob.
Okay, it's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you so much to Bob for sharing his collection with me. And now there's time for a question of the week, which comes from The Scented Gent. What a wonderful Instagram handle. And The Scented Gent wanted to know how to get his Monstera adansonii and his newly purchased moss pole, which actually I think looks like a pole with coir on it, to make friends with each other. This is a really good question and something I hadn't really thought of explaining before, but this is something that is worth considering when you're looking to get a plant growing up a moss pole, particularly if it's coir. The plant won't just latch on and grow without any help. So you need to provide some kind of anchorage. And the thing that I usually recommend is something called German pins or mossing pins. So I just wandered into my local florist and said, "Can I buy a dozen German pins, please?" And she sold me them for 40p. So they're pretty easy to get your hands on if you are anywhere near a florist. I'm sure you can buy them online as well. But hey, why not buy them locally with zero packaging? They just literally went into my pocket. So that's an easy way to get hold of these things. But what are they? Well, they're little metal pins you can get various sizes actually, but the ones I've got are about 3 centimetres, an inch and a bit long, and about 1 centimetre wide, and at the end they've got they're U-shaped, but they've got a little bend in the end, which makes the end rather bigger. I'm not explaining this very well. They're kind of U-shaped with a bump in the end, and I'll post a picture in the show notes so you can see what they look like. And basically what you need to do is get your stem nestled between the prongs of the U and push them into the coir or the moss gently so that the stem doesn't get crushed, but that it is anchored in place. And they should go in quite a long way. You need to angle them sideways and up or down usually to make them work. And you may take a few attempts to get them in exactly the right position, but they work really, really well at holding stems in place. If you find that you've got really meaty stems of a Monstera or something and they are wider than the mossing pin, they are bendable. You should be able to widen them fairly easily. So make sure they're not crushing the stem. I'll put a little story on Instagram to show you how this is done. But this way you should find that the adventitious roots of climbing plants start to appear and mesh with the coir. It also helps if you keep the coir slightly damp through misting. That way the plant is more likely to derive some benefit from being close to that source of moisture. So mossing pins or German pins are what you need. If, however, you're growing a plant on an obelisk, this is actually what my Monstera adansonii is growing on. The thing that I've found that works really well are those tiny little clips that come on Phalaenopsis orchids, holding them to the stake. Now, I take all the stakes out of my Phalaenopsis because I really don't like the way they look, and I let them trail. But I do save the stakes, and I save those little clips, which I then use to clip my Monstera adansonii stems in place. So if you've got some of those, you can use those. Alternatively, you can just buy little tiny hair clips, which work just as well. You can either do them in the same colour as the obelisks, so they fade into the background, or go for a really blingy, contrasting colour if that's what the look that you're looking for. And just remember, when you're anchoring the moss pole into the soil, it's probably wise to have it going right to the bottom of the pot, because the taller it is, the more likely the plant will become top heavy. So anchor it really, really well. You can even use a couple of cable ties to attach it to the bottom of the pot so it really is firmly in place, because there's nothing worse than the whole thing toppling over. And yes, I have been there. Well, I hope that answers your question, the scented gent. And I'm sure that florists around the world will be running out of German/mossing pins before you know it. If you've got a question for On The Ledge, drop me a line on theledgepodcast@gmail.com. That's all for this week's show. We'll be back next Friday when we'll be talking about the death months. Yes, how to get your houseplants through the winter period. So set your sad lamps to overdrive and your grow lights to full power. And I'll see you in a week's time. Bye! Music in this week's episode was Roll Jordan Roll by the Joy Drops, the tracks Chiefs and Endeavour from Jazar, and An Instrument the Boy Called Happy Day Gakana by Samuel Corwin. All tracks are licensed under Creative Commons. See janeperrone.com for details.